Have you ever felt like your own neighbor was playing dictator? Well, let me tell you about the time HOA Karen tried to take over my driveway and how I built a medieval fortress right on my property. I'll never forget that crisp autumn morning. The sky was just beginning to blush with sunrise when I stepped outside, mug of steaming coffee in hand, to greet what I thought would be another peaceful day. Instead, I was met with the ear-splitting sound of someone screaming at the top of her lungs. There, standing at the boundary of my property with a fury that matched the rising sun, was HOA Karen, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed ruler. Her face was a deep crimson, and her eyes burned with indignation as she pointed accusingly at something beyond my gaze. Curious and cautious, I edged closer, only to find that her enormous, gleaming SUV was parked smack in the middle of my driveway. I could hardly believe it. My driveway, a modest concrete slab that had never drawn complaints until that moment, was now being commandeered like it was some coveted piece of territory. "Good morning, Karen," I said softly, hoping that a little civil conversation might de-escalate the situation. Her response was immediate and icy. "It's none of your business," she snapped, her tone brooking no argument. "The HOA says your driveway doesn't meet community standards. And until we sort that out, my car stays put." I stood there, dumbfounded. The driveway had never been an issue before, and here she was, commanding like a queen with a clipboard, armed with arbitrary regulations that made no sense to me at all. The rest of the day passed in a blur of confusion and frustration as I tried to reconcile my peaceful life with the reality of being under siege by HOA Karen. Over the following days, the situation grew increasingly unbearable. Every morning, as I reluctantly ventured outside to start my day, I found Karen's SUV stubbornly in the same spot, as if it were permanently anchored there. I reached out to the HOA, expecting them to mediate the dispute, but they offered nothing more than vague assurances. When I even considered calling a tow company, I was met with a curt refusal. Apparently, attempting to remove Karen's vehicle would be considered harassment under some bizarre community agreement. It was then that a burning question took root in my mind. What rights do I have over my own property? Determined to find answers, I dedicated long nights to poring over local zoning laws and property codes. I scoured every ordinance, every line of legal text, until I stumbled upon a single, revelatory clause. It declared that any temporary security modification on one's private property was entirely legal, as long as it wasn't a permanent structure. That was the loophole I needed. Armed with this legal revelation, I knew I had to act. I wasn't about to let my property, and my peace of mind, be held hostage by Karen's arbitrary rules. I began planning a countermeasure that was as bold as it was unconventional. I reached out to a few trusted friends, a reputable construction crew, and even managed to rent an excavator. Together, we hatched a plan. A 4-foot-deep trench would be dug around my driveway, creating a clear barrier between my property and the intrusion that had become so unbearable. I wasn't simply digging a ditch, I was reclaiming my space. I envisioned the trench as both a physical and symbolic demarcation, a line in the sand that said, "This is my home, and I decide what happens here." And, to add a dash of flair and a nod to the medieval era, I decided that the centerpiece of this defensive strategy would be a drawbridge. Yes, a fully functional, pulley-operated drawbridge that I could raise or lower at my whim, turning my modest driveway into a veritable fortress. The day we began construction was surreal. I remember standing at the edge of my property as the excavator's arm swung into action, carving out a deep, wide trench around my driveway. The sound of metal clanging against concrete, the smell of freshly turned earth, and the sight of my home slowly transforming before my eyes filled me with a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. Every shovelful of dirt removed felt like reclaiming a piece of my autonomy. Neighbors began to take notice. Whispers of "What on earth is she doing?" and curious glances followed me as I supervised the work. I remained resolute, determined to see the project through, even if it meant facing a few raised eyebrows along the way. As the trench neared completion, the real magic began. With the help of skilled contractors, I assembled the drawbridge using reinforced wood, strong metal hinges, and a reliable pulley system. The construction was a labor of love and defiance, and every step of the process was meticulously recorded, not just as evidence that I was following the law, but also as a way to document the absurdity of the entire ordeal. The following morning, the stage was set. The trench lay deep and wide around my driveway, and at its center stood the newly installed drawbridge, a structure that combined practicality with a touch of whimsy. I was both nervous and excited to see how Karen would react to this overt act of reclamation. Sure enough, as the sun climbed higher, Karen arrived with her usual swagger, completely oblivious to the monumental change that had taken place. But the moment she set eyes on her stranded SUV, now trapped in the middle of a meticulously engineered trench, her confident demeanor began to crumble. Her face morphed from one of smug entitlement to sheer disbelief and mounting horror. "What on earth is this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the street. I met her gaze calmly and replied, "It's a security upgrade, Karen. The law says I have every right to protect my property, and now my driveway is exactly as I want it." I produced a crisp printout of the relevant zoning laws, the very document that had lit the spark for my rebellion. It was a moment of sweet vindication. The rules were on my side, and no amount of bluster could change that. For a while, it seemed as though I had finally won. The neighborhood buzzed with excitement as word spread about my trench and drawbridge. Social media exploded with messages of support, and even those who had silently suffered under Karen's tyranny felt emboldened by my stand. Calls of "You go, girl," and "That's one epic drawbridge" filled my inbox and comments. But Karen was not one to accept defeat gracefully. Determined to reassert her authority, she escalated her tactics. Late at night, I began to notice strange disturbances, unauthorized inspectors lurking near my property, unexplained noise complaints, and even a few anonymous reports to the city claiming that my modifications were unsafe. It was as if she had unleashed a small army of petty grievances in a final attempt to undermine my efforts. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, I awoke to a series of frantic sounds outside. Peering through my curtains, I caught sight of a shadowy figure creeping along the edge of my trench. My heart pounded as I recognized the unmistakable silhouette of Karen, flashlight in hand, seemingly on a covert mission to sabotage my drawbridge. I grabbed my phone and started recording, determined to capture every moment of this farcical rebellion. "Karen, what do you think you're doing?" I called out, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. Caught off guard, she spun around, nearly losing her balance. "This is just a routine safety check," she stuttered, trying to mask her true intentions with hollow words. The evidence was clear, however, and the next morning, my video of her sneaking around in the dark went viral. It wasn't long before the entire neighborhood was abuzz with the latest scandal, and even strangers online were laughing at the absurdity of it all. The fallout was swift and decisive. At the next HOA meeting, a tense, emergency gathering called by Karen herself, I walked into the room armed not just with legal documents, but with a dossier of every injustice, every misuse of power that she had perpetrated over the years. I presented my evidence with calm precision, laying out a timeline of petty fines, abusive tactics, and financial misdeeds that no one had dared to challenge until now. The board members, who had long been cowed by her overbearing presence, began to murmur among themselves. With each piece of evidence I laid on the table, the tide turned further in my favor. In a dramatic, unanimous vote that echoed through the room, Karen was stripped of her position as HOA president. It was a cathartic moment, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood, which had suffered in silence for far too long. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in our little community transformed. The oppressive aura of constant surveillance and arbitrary fines gave way to a newfound sense of liberation. Neighbors, emboldened by the fall of their former despot, began speaking up, sharing their own stories of frustration, and even organizing community events that celebrated the return of personal freedom. My driveway, with its striking trench and majestic drawbridge, became a symbol of that rebellion, a quirky landmark where people could gather and laugh about the absurdities of HOA tyranny. I began receiving calls from homeowners in other towns, eager to know how they could stand up to their own overbearing associations. I even found myself giving advice at local meetups and online forums about knowing your rights and the importance of creative resistance. Every compliment, every note of encouragement, reaffirmed that my bold move had sparked something far greater than a personal victory. It had ignited a movement. Yet, even as life returned to a more peaceful rhythm, I couldn't help but feel that the saga wasn't completely over. Karen, ever the stubborn contrarian, continued to attempt small acts of sabotage. One particularly memorable evening, as I was hosting a neighborhood barbecue, I caught sight of a familiar scowl from a distant window. She had been seen watching, her eyes burning with a mix of envy and indignation. But now, rather than inciting fear, her presence only reinforced how far we had come as a community, free from the tyranny of petty rules and overreaching power. Over time, the drawbridge became more than just a security measure. I had it restored and maintained, and it evolved into a playful centerpiece. Kids would dare each other to run up and pull the rope, and visitors often remarked that it gave my house a whimsical, almost fairy tale-like charm. I even installed a small plaque by the trench, inscribed with the words, "In memory of HOA Tyranny," as a nod to the struggle and a reminder of what we had overcome. Now, as I sit here with a cold drink in hand and watch the sunset over my reclaimed driveway, I can't help but reflect on the journey. What began as an infuriating morning confrontation with an overbearing neighbor turned into an epic battle for my right to enjoy my own home. It taught me that knowing your rights is not just about legal jargon, it's about having the courage to stand up for yourself. It proved that creativity, even when it takes on a medieval twist, can be a powerful tool against tyranny. And so, if you ever find yourself up against an impossible neighbor or an HOA that seems determined to control every inch of your life, remember my story. There is always a way to fight back, sometimes with a little ingenuity, a lot of determination, and yes, even a drawbridge. Thank you for joining me on this wild ride. I hope my story inspires you to reclaim your space, challenge the status quo, and always stand up for what's right, even if it means turning your driveway into a fortress.